I will tell you, you are online in 3, 2, 1. You are online.
Should we go ahead and get started?
Yes, you can start now.
Great. Thank you so much for coming,
Genial.
everyone.
Muchas gracias por estar aquí.
Is there a way that I'm hearing both languages?
Yeah,
Is that...
Andrés, te estamos escuchando en el canal central.
Sí, aparentemente ya no tengo el perfil de interpretación. ¿Me lo puedes asignar de nuevo, por favor?
Shall I wait, or because he doesn't have an interpreter?
Give us a second, Jennie, please,
Okay.
because my interpret profile was not ready.
Yep.
Lo acabo de actualizar, Andrés. ¿Estás listo? Okay, perfect. You can continue, please. Sorry.
Okay. Oh, no problem. I've been there. It's needlessly confusing, I think. But thank you. So thank you so much for coming. Welcome to Unlocking the Potential Libraries, Introducing Controlled Digital Lending. My name is Jennie Halperin, and I am the Executive Director of Library Futures Institute, a nonprofit organization that seeks to empower libraries to take control of their digital futures. I'll be dropping links into the chat periodically and also provide a list of links to all participants, particularly folks who are streaming after this session. So we have an incredibly illustrious panel with us, so I'll be handing it over to them pretty quickly. We have Courtney, Copyright Advisor and Program Manager at Harvard University and Board Chair of Library Futures, Michelle Wu, Professor Emerita at Georgetown University and former Associate Dean of the Library, and Lila Bailey, Policy Counsel of the Internet Archive. We're going to be discussing a few issues today, issues that are of great importance to libraries, in particular digital libraries. We're going to be particularly focusing on a recent policy paper from the Library Futures Foundation called Controlled Digital Lending, Unlocking the Library's Full Potential, which you might recognize from the title, which was written in collaboration with the Georgetown Institute for Law and Policy. I will put that link in the chat. So we're going to hear from Lila, Kyle, and Michelle, both about the basis of and cases for CDL, and also how libraries are working to make equitable digital lending a reality utilizing this important and innovative technology. After Lila, Kyle, and Michelle present, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A, moderated by Stephen Wyber, if he's here, and myself, but in which case, just myself. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll hand it over to Lila now.
Thanks so much, Jennie. So my name is Lila Bailey. As mentioned, I'm Policy Counsel for the Internet Archive. We are a nonprofit digital library headquartered in the United States. And we have been working on this library practice of controlled digital lending for about 10 years now. It wasn't called controlled digital lending in the very beginning. The phrase is more recent, but the practice is longstanding at this point. I am not going to go into a huge amount of detail on all of the many benefits of controlled digital lending, because I think they are really well laid out in the policy paper that Jennie has just put into the chat here. But I'm going to focus on just 4 high-level ones here as I lead into the conversation about how it actually works. So one of the most important things that controlled digital lending does is it really allows libraries to get a better return on taxpayer investments in their library collections. Public libraries, of course, are taxpayer supported, but many other kinds of libraries also get large amounts of taxpayer dollars in the form of grants and other resource allocation. So what controlled digital lending does is it takes the library's collection that the library's already paid for and just allows those materials to be made available to their patrons in a digital format on the same basis as they had previously, on a one-to-one basis. I will explain again in detail how it works in a minute. The second really important thing I want to highlight that CDL does is it safeguards patron privacy. This is something that, that many people don't think about when they're checking out ebooks from their local libraries, is that libraries are under state laws that require us to follow particular patron privacy practices. These same laws don't apply to vendors and publishers. So when you check out a book using something like Overdrive, the publishers get access to information that they don't get access to when a library controls its own collection digitally. Of course, we saw during the pandemic that everybody became a homeschooler. Everybody had to learn how to learn from home and teach from home. And controlled digital lending became a very essential and important service for libraries for libraries, teachers, students, everyone really, to support education. And these benefits are important even after COVID, God willing, passes us by, hopefully soon. But we've now learned how important controlled digital lending is in supporting education. And the final one I want to talk about is combating misinformation. It has become almost a cliche at this point to say that the truth is paywalled, but lies are free. And that's not a world that as a library, as a lawyer for a library or any of us want to live in, right? Where when we're looking for information, the easiest information to find is misinformation that's being promoted by either nefarious sources or just, spammers and other kinds of folks, and not the credible published information that's been vetted through peer review and other sorts of processes. And so controlled digital lending is one of the important tools that we have in our toolbox for combating that online misinformation, because it allows the sort of credible published information to be available to people through their screens, through their devices, where they are looking for answers to important questions of the day. So before March of 2020, controlled digital lending was one of those things that, the three of us here, Kyle and Michelle and I, all knew was important, but most libraries, I think, or many libraries, saw it as a nice to have. It was something that was an additive service, but there were a lot of conflicting priorities. Over the course of the last 18 months, what we've seen in our libraries is that controlled digital lending really became an essential service. It became the way that libraries could provide access to their collections while their libraries were physically closed away from the students and the faculty during the COVID-19 pandemic. And during the last 18 months, what we've all realized is, oh, that emergency access is the kind of access we need all the time. This is not actually something that should be turned off, but in fact should be turned on even more, right? That we need digitized digital access to our library collections now more than ever. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the Internet Archive and how we have been doing controlled digital lending for the last decade. I was hoping to be able to do a screen share here. I don't know if this is going to work. I wanted to walk through. I did not do a test of this beforehand, so I'm just going to try, see if this works. Okay, I'm hoping that people can see my screen now. What I wanted to do is show, great, thanks, Kyle. What I wanted to do is actually just show folks how you can check out a book using archive.org. So this is our homepage, archive.org. And now if you scroll down here to our main search box, you can type in anything that you are looking for. I already pre-typed in this search query because I know this book is a book that we've recently digitized. And importantly, this book is something that was published in the 1960s, but is now out of print. So I'm going to go ahead and search for it. And now what it's doing is it's searching through all of the library metadata that we have. Oh, good, it actually worked. And now here is the actual book. Now I am logged in, but I have not yet borrowed this book. And so what you see is just the front matter of the book, but it's a limited preview. And so really all you can see is just sort of the title page. Sometimes you'll get a table of contents, but until I check it out, that's all I can see. Now I've already logged in as myself. You do need a library card from the Internet Archive in order to check out books. That is anybody with an email address, so it's pretty easy to get. We do lend to the whole world. So I'm going to go ahead and borrow this book for 1 hour. That's the loan period for this particular book. Okay, and now we see I have access to the whole book. And I can click around and see these cool all these cool different illustrations. Now, if somebody else were to come and try to borrow this book, they would be on the wait list and they would have to wait in line until I return the book or until the loan period ends. Just like they would in a regular sort of licensed library scenario or with physical books. And the reason I wanted to talk about this book is to actually demonstrate another really cool thing that we can do using controlled digital lending. And that is, controlled digital lending has allowed the Internet Archive to actually link citations into Wikipedia articles. And so what we can see here, this is the Wikipedia article for the term petticoat. And this same book has actually been cited here in the sorry, things are covering my, this control bar is covering my screen and I can't see it. Okay, sorry. So we can see here that link number 3 goes to this dictionary of costume, and I can click here onto the page 267, and it links you straight into the book to the exact right page that the citation comes from. So that's one of the ways in which we have been trying to bolster Wikipedia and fight against misinformation to have this, reliable published information available right where people are looking for answers. So I am going to close out of that and actually just talk a little bit about, so that's how it works at the Internet Archive with our collection. Now, we also have a program that allows other libraries to work with us to lend out their books through our controlled digital lending environment. We now have 87 libraries that are signed up to lend out their books using controlled digital lending on the archive. So now I want to stop the share screen. There we go. Okay, sorry, that was a little bit of a live demo, always a little bit of a risk in doing that. Okay, though that's Open Library, that's the Internet Archive, and then Open Libraries program. And we are just one flavor of controlled digital lending, or one iteration of controlled digital lending. There are actually hundreds of other libraries around the country and in Canada that are also participating in controlled digital lending in different implementations. And I am just going to I was going to drop in some links to some things, but I think I'm running a little bit over. So I want to just say that we at the Internet Archive have heard over the last 18 months from hundreds of different people around the world about how important controlled digital lending has been to them throughout this pandemic. Of course, not everybody is in love with the idea of controlled digital lending, and there are publishers and authors groups that have claimed that there is a negative impact on publishing markets and book markets because of controlled digital lending. And this idea, this belief that library lending cannibalizes book sales is a persistent belief. But it's basically an unproven assertion. There's not a lot of public data supporting it. And in fact, over the last 18 months, we've seen more controlled digital lending than ever before because of the pandemic. And despite this, publishers have been showing record profits. Their profits were way up in 2020, and they are on track to be, if not the same, maybe even better for the coming year. So that seems to suggest that at least controlled digital lending and book profits can go hand in hand. More CDL, more profits, everybody wins, right? One would think so. But nevertheless, unfortunately, 4 of the world's largest publishers have sued the Internet Archive over this library lending practice. And so this is active litigation, and I am not going to comment any further on it from here. I am actually going to turn it over to my wonderful colleagues, Kyle and Michelle, to talk a little bit about the legal basis and framework behind controlled digital lending, and then about the lawsuit against the Internet Archive. All right, thanks so much.
Thanks, Lulu. So I'm Michelle Wu, and I'm going to start simply by providing the basics of both CDL as well as the legal theory that underlies it. So to make sure we're all on the same page as to what CDL is, I first want to describe that. So all it is a method through which libraries can take collections that they own, transform them to a different format, and use that new format in place of the original. So the most common application today is the one that Lila described, which is digitizing a print copy of a book and using the ebook version in place of the print. There are any number of ways to implement CDL, but in order to meet the definition, a library must meet 3 criteria. The first is that the library must legitimately own a copy of the work, which means that licensed materials do not apply to CDL. The second requirement is that the library must respect an own-to-loan ratio, which means that it cannot lend more copies than it owns. If a library owns 5 copies of work, it can lend 5 copies online, 0 in print, 3 online, 2 in print, or any combination that does not exceed the number of copies it owns. And the third requirement is that any e-copy that is lent has to be controlled by some sort of digital rights management, or DRM, to prevent wholesale copying and redistribution. Now, moving to the legal theory. The legal theory on which CDL is based is a uniquely American one, which is called fair use. Obviously, there are other countries with similar doctrines, such as fair dealing, but I did want to make that distinction obvious from the start. So what is fair use? Fair use is a use that is not authorized by the copyright owner, but where the public benefit is considered so great that it warrants overriding the copyright owner's rights. For a court to assess whether a use is fair or not, it is required to look at 4 factors. It can look at other factors as well, but it is by statute required to take a look at 4. Those 4 factors are the purpose and character of use, the nature of the work, the amount and substantiality used, and the market harm. For the purposes of today's discussion, I'm only going to talk about factors 1 and 4, because courts have largely said in recent cases that factors 2 and 3 are not determinative. It really all comes down to what is decided in factor 1 and 4. So I'll start with factor 1, which is the purpose and character of use. In terms of the purpose and character of use, litigants often try to go for what I call knockout punches in the arguments. And that's trying to find a use that's commercial or that is transformative. And the reason why they try to go for those arguments first is because those elements are so strong, they often can overwhelm the rest of the analysis and determine the outcome. If a use is commercial, it likely is not going to be fair use. If a use is transformative, which just means that it is fundamentally different from what the author intended the use to be. If a use is transformative, the use is likely going to be fair. In the case of CDL, I will maintain that neither of those knockout factors are actually going to play a huge role in the analysis. And that's largely because when we're talking about CDL, we're talking about library lending by nonprofit libraries. So there isn't a commercial aspect. And even though courts have actually left open a window for us to argue that CDL is transformative, I'm actually going to go with the more standard interpretation and say that because we're talking about format shifting, we're talking about using a digital copy in place of the original, but the digital copy serves the same purpose. It allows a reader to use a book, that this is not transformative for the purposes of factor one. That said, the vast majority of fair uses are actually not transformative. So we can still continue along the path of analyzing factor one without any of those knockout factors. And I would actually say that the argument for CDL, I think, is actually as strong, if not stronger than as for a transformative use. And the reason is that CDL in many ways actually embodies the entire purpose of copyright. Copyright, as it shows up in the copyright clause in our Constitution and as it shows up in our laws, is intended to be a balance between rights. It ultimately is designed to further the public interest in sharing information, but it allows the author to control their work and make a profit off of it because that is seen to incentivize the creation of works to enter and be available to the public to use. All the laws and doctrines of copyright law are intended to keep that balance between the private and the public interest. And one of those doctrines is called the Exhaustion Doctrine. And that doctrine says that once a copyright owner has sold a copy of her work, she loses all rights to control downstream uses of that work. And the principle behind that is that her private right in copyright has been exhausted once she has made that sale. And if you take a look at how CDL actually works, it exemplifies the exhaustion doctrine perfectly. The library has paid for the copies that it uses, which means that the author's right has been exhausted, and it only uses the same number of copies that it has purchased for the public good. So in the case of the first factor, I would say that it weighs heavily in favor of fair use because CDL actually does serve the purpose that was intended by the exhaustion doctrine. Moving on to the fourth factor, I want to note that this is about market harm or potential harm to the market of the work. But even though it's phrased that way, factor 4 doesn't actually prevent harm overall. There are a lot of legitimate uses that actually could harm the market of the work that will never come under analysis when you're taking a look at factor 4. An example is used books. So the availability of used books might indeed impact the market of those same books in an unused format. But at the same time, that's a perfectly legitimate use and would never come under the fair use analysis. What a factor 4 is looking at is a very specific type of harm. It is looking at the harm of an unauthorized copy replacing an unsold copy on the market. And my argument is that in CDL, or that CDL actually escapes that definition entirely. And this is the reason why. The copy that a library is using in CDL doesn't replace an unsold copy on the market. It replaces the paid copy that the library has in its collection. And so for that reason, it actually has a neutral effect on the market as it has already paid for the work that it's using. So again, in factor 4, I would argue that that comes out in favor of fair use as well. What I want to comment on generally in terms of the theory, I've given you the nutshell explanation. I understand there are a lot of side arguments, and we're happy to answer those in the Q&A. But the overall point that I want to make about CDL is it is unique when it's looking at fair use cases. When you look at the body of case law, you really don't see an actor who is paid for the exact same number of copies that it's using. And that's exactly what's happening with CDL and libraries. So I do think it is a very, very unique case. I realize I don't have a lot of time, but I do want to make a very, very quick comment about the court case that is in progress right now. It's called Hachette versus Internet Archive. It's publishers that have mentioned as part of their claim that CDL is illegal. I would be happy to go into a detailed analysis of that complaint, but I know there isn't time. So I just want to make one broad comment about the case, and then I'm happy to take questions in the Q&A. My broad comment is this, is reading through the complaint, I actually don't think there's a strong case against CDL. And the reason that I say that it's not a strong case is because the research that the publishers did is obviously careless. They don't see CDL as a broad principle that exists beyond Internet Archive. All they do is they look at the Internet Archive. They don't acknowledge all of the public benefits that CDL brings, whether it's preservation or outreach to underserved populations. In the complaint, they explicitly say that CDL hurts libraries when we know that it actually does not. It helps us and it helps our communities. However, this sloppiness in how they have phrased that complaint, I think is actually a bigger danger to CDL. Because if those publishers are able to persuade the courts to take their beliefs and fears as facts, when they are only showing a very, very biased view of CDL and not even all of the facts that are out there, we risk losing access to CDL based on that belief. So I think it is incumbent on many of us who are aware of the full framework of CDL to make sure the courts have all of the necessary information available before they make their decision. I'll turn this over to Kyle.
Thank you so much, Michelle. So I'm going to just hit a few highlights here and then talk a little bit about the underlying policy document. Again, my name is Courtney. I am excited to talk about this topic always. One thing that was mentioned is exhaustion. Michelle did a great job of discussing exhaustion, and I know many of us know exhaustion here internationally. In the US, we call it first sale. But the idea of digital exhaustion being problematic, I think is interesting. There's a case here in the United States called Redigi, which gets brought out a lot and says, you know what, we think digital music in this case is different. And in that particular case, I thought Redigi doesn't really settle the issue. And as Michelle says, you know, we disagree with the interpretation that somehow CDL is legal. In fact, not only is it legal, it is happening presently and is one of the many powers that libraries can deal with. But the Redigi case, which is again about digital first sale for music files, is about a competitive marketplace. Redigi, the company, was selling used MP3 files, right? That idea that they wanted to create a market of used, much like our used bookstores and our used record stores. The secondary market is important, but it is actually considered. But this idea of digital exhaustion through Redigi, it doesn't quite settle the issue. If anything, the language of the court emphasizes that the potential for non-commercial transformative fair uses like controlled digital lending is very possible. So I'd just like to say there has been very little litigation on this, but in the case of controlled digital lending, we had a court say, you know, there's a possibility for non-commercial transformative uses that are not mixing the market. The advantage of libraries is that we own our collections. We purchase our collections with the idea of future access in mind, not future sale, future access. And to quote from this case, you know, a fair use can be transformative, much like Michelle was discussing, but the court went on to say it can be transformative when it utilizes technology to achieve this transformative purpose of improving delivery of content without unreasonably encroaching on the commercial entitlements of the rights holder. So if we can utilize and harness technology and not encroach inside a market that exists, then we're capable of making this fair use. And I would present to everyone here today that nothing is more important than libraries existing in the digital space where their users are. So again, it's transferring the mission of libraries from the physical space to the digital space. And we have seen this grow and grow during the pandemic when the needs were very great. But nevertheless, we're going to see, I think, more use of CDL over the next several years even in spite of the fact that this litigation exists. And I'd also like to mention that we will see more digital libraries. The concept that Internet Archive is a library is something that apparently is contentious. And it is not to me, obviously. You can, as Lila demonstrated, you can check out a book with your library card. You can actually go there physically and listen to their collections and access their collections, or you can do it online. I think it's very important that we note that the future of libraries is digital, both as space and as function. So getting to those core components for a moment and shifting gears a little bit away from the litigation and towards Library Futures Foundation new policy document, which is the title of this talk, Controlled Digital Lending, Unlocking the Library's Full Potential. I, of course, was very pleased to be able to work to announce this. And what this does is this document takes a little bit away from the legal rationale that we've been discussing and focuses on the policy reasons for controlled digital lending's existence. And I think the policy reasons that underline its existence are often look exactly like the policy reasons for the existence of libraries in your communities today. The document, which I saw Jennie had linked to earlier, covers all the benefits, the innovations, and the goals that are basis of any digital loaning system, not just controlled digital lending, but really any library that's loaning digitally. And again, it expands beyond this rationale. And I'd just like to hit some of the highlights of this discussion inside the paper, because I think it's important that you understand that the mission and mode of controlled digital lending is merely replicating the policy arguments that underline the existence of libraries altogether. So, one, communities rely on libraries to serve as a hub for general learning, for research, for knowledge, and for access to materials that they require for education. So CDL does one thing very importantly. It drives the economic efficiency of libraries, right? Lila talked about maximizing the return on tax dollars. Here in the United States, public libraries and state libraries that are funded with taxes buy materials for access to those people. And it makes complete sense that you want to maximize your return on that by continuing to allow the public to access the materials that they, in all essence, paid for. Second, it also evens the playing field with regards to reliable and equitable education. Libraries serve often as a hub for education, but also for access to internet, for information. Sometimes they serve in a public space, but as far as making education affordable, obviously, many of us are familiar with the textbook crisis and the inability for students to access materials. They can't afford everything. And this levels the playing field for most students, no matter if they're K through 12 or higher education, to have equal access to these materials as they have had in the physical library. But what if they can't get there? What if for health and safety concerns it's closed? What if they are disabled in some way and mobility is an issue? CDL solves those. And in that way, it does the third thing. It promotes civil rights for marginalized communities. CDL, much like any library, does not necessarily care how much money you earn, where you are, if you're differently abled, what you are required to get your information. We will provide it for you. And this way, it maximizes open, non-discriminatory access to materials. So, lastly, it improves access. Digitization and the notion of digitizing our collection for future generations is critical to something that I do in my work. CDL offers a unique opportunity for us to look at the collections that are in our stacks, in which we have spent millions of dollars over the decades, that may never make the jump to digital unless we make that jump. And the libraries have control over these collections that are in print and sitting on our shelves. What if we were capable of digitizing them and making them available? And again, the majority of the works may not make the jump to digital. So I think it's in our best interest for society, for community, and for libraries to digitize and maximize the ability for those to use, access, and create new works from, right? And sure, there's an inherent risk, but we think this policy document, as we outline it here, will be very useful for understanding how these principles play a role in the creation of a potential controlled digital lending bill. That would be the dream. The idea is that the court case could end tomorrow if they passed a bill that said controlled digital lending is just another action that libraries do. And this is important. The policy reasons are not saying controlled digital lending is illegal and we need a federal bill to solve this issue. What we're saying, much like interlibrary loan and a lot of other library powers that exist, a controlled digital lending bill could merely codify the actions that hundreds of libraries are doing between the US and Canada right now. In the history of interlibrary loan, sharing books between libraries, that used to be something that we did. It predated copyright law. In fact, libraries predate copyright law. The idea is that the interlibrary loan code just merely codified an action that we're doing. And here we're looking at the same exact argument. These policy reasons could be a potential net amplifier for libraries to just codify what actions we are already doing. And obviously, Congress should support their communities by empowering libraries to serve as meaningful access points for these publicly funded collections. So I'll end my policy talk there and turn it back over to our hosts and welcome some Q&A.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentations. It's always a delight to hear from all of you. Just to kind of kick us off, a question that I would have that I'm looking forward to asking all of you is we talked a little bit about how CDL is applicable in US law, but I'm wondering if you could address how either you've seen CDL being used in international contexts or whether or not it could be applied in an international setting outside of the United States.
So I guess I should probably answer that. So the Internet Archive has been working with a number of Canadian institutions over the years on controlled digital lending, including the University of Toronto, the University of Alberta, and a number of public libraries, including Hamilton Public Library and Milton Public Library. And the basis there is fair dealing, which is similar but different to the United States legal framework. I believe there's going to be a whole session tomorrow about controlled digital lending in international contexts. And there are smarter people than I am who are going to be on that panel. And so I will just pitch everybody to like join that tomorrow.
And I would just add, I thought that the IFLA statement that was released in support of controlled digital lending, which I'm sure will be the subject of tomorrow's discussion, however, would represent that international library communities came together and said, freedom to acquire and lend, digital uses should be flexible. It is acceptable to make use of one or more exceptions at a time for libraries. All of those kind of framework they have in that paper, I think, is an excellent driving point for saying, we think we could do this in country X, right? Regardless of its fair dealing, fair use. I've seen also free use translated recently. So they think it maps in the same way that I hope the policy paper maps to this is the reason libraries exist. And we need to jump into this space. It's well within our rights and duties and obligations as a library to provide that. So I thought that IFLA statement was a big plus for it moving internationally.
So I'd just like to remind everyone, if you do have questions, please use the Q&A button or use the chat function here. I was going to jump in with a question, in fact, and I think, Kyle, you sort of touched on it a little bit about when you talked about the fate of books that never come out digitally and the risks there. I was wondering if all of the panelists could address the question of what is the cost of non-CDL? What happens if we don't do it? Because sometimes it helps to focus the mind when you think about the costs.
So I'll start, although I'm sure that Kyle and Lila will have comments as well. I mean, I think that both of them have already talked about some of the costs of not doing CDL. That comes in natural disasters. We know that the number of natural disasters, climate change, is just increasing over time. And obviously the libraries that are in the path of any storm, of any fire, there's a risk of loss of materials. And where those libraries have unique materials that might be particular to their community or collections, those could be lost forever. So, I mean, that is a real risk of not using CDL. The other is whether or not there is, I mean, hopefully, as Lila says, this pandemic will end, but that doesn't mean that it's the last pandemic. It doesn't mean that there is the last possible disaster that is going to close all of our libraries suddenly. And if that happens, the digital form is really the only way to reach our users. CDL allows for preservation and access and duplication of preservation options such that it safeguards against just about every disaster, or at least you could put together a model that safeguards against any disaster, and also enables libraries to collaborate in building a complete collection across the world to save all of culture, all of published resources for everyone, which no library by itself can do. But through CDL, that type of collaboration does become possible. It actually does become possible to create a global library where every language, every title is represented. So I think that not doing CDL means that you sacrifice all of that.
Amen, Michelle. I mean, well stated, well stated. I will say too, like, one of the things that really hit home, I think, for a lot of people, but I'll just speak for myself here, is when you are shut off, when you're shut out from your library, your local library, you're really cut off from a really huge resource, right? And there are so many people for whom that is true all the time, right? And this is people in rural communities who live, maybe 50 miles from the closest physical library. It may be people who are differently abled, who physically cannot travel or even hold a book. There are some people for whom even just flipping the pages in a book is a challenge, or they simply can't do it. And so I think the costs of not doing controlled digital lending is to basically perpetuate sort of the haves and have-nots and the digital divides that we already have seen. And the people who don't have access to those resources are just cut off from their ability to learn, their ability to find jobs, their ability to participate in a democratic society, frankly. So I actually think the risks are quite high of not doing controlled digital lending.
And I'll add one or two more just for fun. Not only would CDL programs promote digitization of collections, it also might promote accessibility of those collections as a natural side benefit of that, right? OCR, texting, getting it read, making it possible to be read on screen readers or JAWS or whatever, that increases the likelihood that would occur. Additionally, less focus. I focus on what would happen if the next generation got all of the works of the previous generation that they've never seen, right? So the next generation of library users, nothing will be real to them unless it's digital and available in that space. And I like to imagine that all of this stuff becomes available. They will have a corpus of unbelievable amounts of materials to which draw from to, I don't know, make humanity strive for better. And I know that is very highfalutin. But I'm high-minded with that, in that no generation would have more access to materials than this. So the risk would be to continue the siloing of our culture. And I think so that's one of the things that I care about.
if I can add one additional note, building on Lila and Kyle, is just that also by not using CDL, you lose a lot of the benefits of technology as we advance. So there are a lot of books that will never be translated into other languages other than their native languages, right? But I'm not saying that computer translation is great, it is not, but you actually can give access to people to books from other cultures much more easily if it is in a digitized form, and computer tools that translate can help provide that access where it doesn't otherwise exist.
Thank you so much. And in our last 10 minutes, would you have some time to maybe touch on how CDL intersects, relates to, works with other library processes like interlibrary loan?
Sure, you may be aware, Jenny, that a group called CDL Co-op just recently introduced a statement of principles
I have it pulled up.
tying interlibrary loan and CDL. And I'll comment briefly. You can read the document for yourselves, but it's the concept that if you believe in controlled digital lending, right? The right to digitize and loan a book that's a returnable, important phrase in interlibrary loan community, a book that's going to come back to your library. If you believe in CDL for your own library, then clearly the next phase would be, oh, could we CDL with our external libraries like we do in interlibrary loan? It is nearly the same exact process, right? The idea that a book is being loaned out to another library, they give it to their user, and then it comes back through the cycle. So the scope here was really interesting, and in co-writing this with a number of other authors, I was really interested in to find that most interlibrary loan codes do say, hey, you should use the quickest, most efficient thing possible and harness technology to complete that mission. And I thought to myself, wow, we were predicting CDL, 40 years ago when we wrote this code. And so the alignment there, I think, is a natural alignment. And the process could easily be built into our systems that already do interlibrary loan. I came up through interlibrary loan. That's how I got here to a certain extent. And we were almost like the circulation desk for the other libraries. So these processes are already automated. They already involve scanning sometimes. They already involve copyright checks. They already involve all the process that would go along with a CDL system.
So I'll go a step further and say that the way that I've always envisioned CDL from the very beginning was that anything that I can do with a print book, I can do with a CDL book. So if it's used in consortium, if it's used in shared collections, if it's used in collection development, if it's used in ILL, if it's used in document delivery, if I can use the print for that, I can certainly use the CDL copy for it.
Go ahead, Stephen.
So I was going to follow up quickly with a question. I don't know if, Jenny, you were going to follow on the question you've just asked. So I suppose I was going to ask, Kyle, you mentioned the suggestion of coming up with a form of CDL bill, or trying to actually make it clearer in law that this is possible. And understandably, especially within the library field, people are often unwilling to do things that look too risky. Often they're working with public money. They didn't get in it for the litigation most of the time, which is sort of understandable. What do you see the steps as being towards trying to get this sort of thing tabled at a state level, at a federal level, elsewhere?
Yeah, wow, that's a big question, Stephen. So certainly any good law emerged from excellent grassroots efforts, right? And here I would say we have grassroots efforts that are excellent. People have been using controlled digital lending for over a decade now, right? So it's been in the library populace, most notably the Open Library Program, but that has now spread. And I think the last 3 years we've seen an exponential rise. And there's a phrase that's out there currently called "Let's Make CDL Boring," meaning it's a motto being like, oh, this is just run-of-the-mill stuff. To get something through US Congress would take some time, obviously. But part of the messaging, I think, was amplified during the pandemic crisis when we had those closures, and people realized how many materials were inaccessible because of the physicality tied to that. And, Michelle and I and Lila have had the benefit of doing previous Hill walks physically to talk about the CDL, and then moving to Capitol Hill digitally in the last year or so to discuss these issues and to reveal to the legislators there, members of Congress, that this is important for several kind of policy reasons that we outlined in the paper. Whether the CDL bill is such an incredible question, and it's not just the US that's going through it right now. I know RLUK, David Prosser wrote a blog post about this where he asked the same thing. He said, whether the statute in the bill in England as well. And I think there is something like a magic wand that gets waved over something if there's a bill associated with it. But it's not necessary here, I think, because of all the reasons Michelle outlined. This is already legal. Codifying it would help demystify any concerns of the library community. But legislation is, the courts are one thing and legislation is another. I don't know where libraries get a better shake, but I turned it to my co-panelists to be interested in what they thought.
So I think there's certainly, I think legislation is worth exploring, but always with legislation, I do worry that depending on how it's crafted, how it's tailored, it can also do harm as well as good. Because fair use is such a strong argument, and because it is adaptable, I have to admit that I tend to like the fair use argument more than the idea of legislation for CDL. That doesn't mean that I don't think that all avenues should be explored at least, but I will say that I probably have some more reservations about legislation than I do relying on existing fair use.
Yeah, so again, I mean, like, we're in a fair use fight already, so we're doing it. I hear all of Michelle's concerns about that, right? First of all, you can get a judge that either doesn't understand the arguments or for whatever reason decides to go a different way, right? And so unfortunately, this is a case that's likely to go on for quite some time, as we saw with the Redigi case, as we saw with the Google Books case, as we saw with the Georgia State case. Like, sometimes these cases take 5 to 10 years to resolve. So it is going to take a long time to resolve either way, right? Whether we go the legislative route or we go the court route, which is already going. Either way, we're not going to have legal certainty for libraries around this for a while. And in the meantime, libraries kind of are going to have to decide whether they're going to sit on their hands and wait and risk all of the things that we talked about when you don't proceed with controlled digital lending, or move forward, as many libraries have already decided it's imperative to do. And so really, unfortunately, legal certainty is not in our future anytime soon either way. And so, I think the hope of panels like this one is to try to do as much as we can to demystify the legal issues and the policy issues for folks, so that libraries can make an educated decision about this and not just a decision based on being afraid and just being like, well, that's too scary, it's too confusing, we're not even going to try.
And so, because we're just reminded that the session is going to close automatically in 4 minutes, I'm going to start heading us toward a wrap up and thank all of our panelists and to Stephen for getting us together and moderating the Q&A. Again, I work with Kyle and Lila and Michelle for our policy group of Library Futures, which is a nonprofit organization based here in the United States. And we have a number of webinars and events that coming up, and also a few that we've done on both the technical implementations of CDL, frequently asked questions about CDL, myth busting of CDL, lots of CDL content out there. Right before this closes, I will make sure that these links are dropped in the chat. And as Kyle also just dropped, I would invite all of you to help us empower libraries to take control of their digital futures and to join us. You can reach out via our website or our email at Join Our Coalition, come to our events, and get to hear from these fabulous people again in the future. We really, really appreciate your coming. Thank you so much. Does anybody else have anything to add in our last 3 minutes? Okay, I'm going to pull up some webinars that you can watch and just thank you all again.
And I'll just send a quick reminder, don't forget to come along tomorrow at 1 p.m. UTC, where we're going to be following up and talking a little bit more about the potential to apply to draw on CDL already in other parts of the world, looking both at the potential under national law and the potential under international law. So do join us then, and the link will go into the chat.
I also want to just thank the organizers of IP Week 2021. Every session I've been to so far has been fascinating, and I look forward to participating and to attending more sessions over the course of the week. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks everybody. This has been really fun. And I hope lots of folks show up tomorrow. I think this is like not a great time for people in Europe and other parts of the world. It's quite late. So hopefully, I know it's being recorded. So hopefully this panel will live on in its digital form. And just always such a pleasure to work with all of you guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.